We are joined by Yaroslav Makitra, head of political programs at the research center Sociopolis. Good afternoon, good morning, Yaroslav. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
Welcome.
Good morning.
So, Yaroslav, in your opinion, what is happening in Russia right now? It's interesting that the bunker dweller hadn't appeared for so long, only to finally come out and announce that he had come up with new objectives. For Russia's war against Ukraine, yes, something about children. What's interesting is that there was recently quite an amusing news story about how they made those very children go on stage and sing a song about not needing the internet. An internet which is now being blocked more and more in the Russian Federation. Apparently, Putin has already, with his propaganda narratives moved on. He's already thought, why do I need all these Solovyovs and Skabayevas? Here they are, the children, raise a new generation. But what's interesting is that in Russia, any kind of statement is usually made to cover something up. So, in your opinion, what exactly does the Kremlin want to hide? Who is all this information actually aimed at? What are they preparing the information space for, in your view?
Well, right now, Russia is at the stage in the war where there is a kind of rethinking of what is happening. Let me explain what I mean. The blitzkrieg failed a long time ago. Then there was a whole series of preparatory operations, various offensives that were announced, but they also failed to deliver the desired results. And finally, there is now a growing realization and widespread understanding that even the so-called diplomatic negotiations that took place, the so-called Anchorage spirit, which the Russians frequently refer to as a unique diplomatic spirit. Furthermore, Anchorage also did not provide any significant assistance to the Russian Federation in their attempts to exert influence over Ukraine or the progression of the conflict. That is to say, it did not help them to successfully accomplish any of the strategic objectives they had set out to achieve. This is precisely the point being emphasized here. Nor did it help them to capture the Donbas region and by doing so systematically destabilize and destroy Ukraine from the inside by throwing in this particular element. The negotiation process itself about the possibility of withdrawing from Donbas and everything else, and so on. None of this happened. The Russians failed to break Ukraine at that stage as they had hoped. Now there is some rethinking going on because let's say the war has to continue. A war that one way or another is becoming unpopular in Russia. And against this backdrop, information platforms are being shut down. The fight against the internet, against free will and expression, and then also Telegram, which has essentially become a platform for many anti-system speakers, has turned into a good platform with a lot of criticism that obviously the FSB does not control at this stage. And there are many other things that now have to be launched, if only to cover up what is happening in order to control the information space. And then there's this speech by Putin where he talks about the goals of the so-called special operation. Well, the goals mentioned there are no longer about taking Kiev or Lviv, just I say this based on what they said before, Donbas. This already shows that things are not going as planned, but these statements are being made and things are happening. The gathering of consequences for the war among... This is not the first time, by the way, that businessmen in Russia have experienced this. A few years ago, something similar happened, and now it's happening again. What stands out is this insistence that we must help, we must support the war, because war is inevitable, because such enemies have surrounded us. In fact, at this stage, it's a rethinking of what has failed and an attempt to continue the war, an attempt to find resources, and at the same time, to silence those who are dissatisfied with the process, those who no longer believe in these statements from Putin and his circle about how the goals of the special military operation will be achieved, as they used to say before.
Well, Yaroslav, yes, probably, of course, wealthy people in the Russian Federation have already been forced to chip in for this war that the Kremlin is waging against independent Ukraine. But in my opinion, so openly without actually offering any options. I think this is the first time. But it's not just about the oligarchs. In fact, in Buryatia, for example, there was information, and this was reported by a completely Russian publication called Baikal Lights. Work collectives are proposing to donate all of their earnings for one day. And all of it is exclusively for the continuation of military actions because people believe this is what needs to be done. Back in the day, even during the Soviet Union, school children used to collect money for various things. These were propaganda needs, and work collectives would come together in a unified impulse just the same. They would also propose to chip in for something, to pool all their earnings from one day or even a week, for some similar purposes. It's like going back to the past. There's no other way to put it. And apparently there is no money at all, but they still have to hold on somehow. But what do you think, in fact, about these kinds of campaigns for the oligarchs because there are no other options? Whoever doesn't chip in for the war will end up at the front with their business tomorrow, or rather with whatever is left of it. And as for ordinary people, there won't be any other options at all, just the war.
Yeah, there's less and less money for the war, and the war is becoming less and less popular. You can see that from the sociological surveys that are still being conducted in Russia. There are some companies whose data can be considered more or less relevant, like Vitsium and others. But when it comes to raising funds for the war, they've basically been collecting them since the second or third year of the war, just in different ways, under different pretexts and so on. Well, that's volunteering Russian style, In Ukraine, it's hard to imagine the authorities collecting money like that in an obligatory manner, collecting money for the war specifically and so on. So even if there are some incentives for certain things, it's not done so publicly and not in that way. Indeed, but otherwise it just won't work in Russia, meaning it's not developed there. Basically, for the most part, there are no grassroots initiatives there. Any kind of connections, this volunteering support and so on, yes, it exists, but it's very, they have a lot of this, especially since it's a war, an aggressive one, everyone understands that. So there's this pressure from above, targets are set, and so on and so forth. Everything, just like in the Soviet Union, like in Russia, everything goes according to plan, as they say. They have no other option. But again, I repeat, this once more shows that the war is stalling again, and the question arises, what next? And Putin is already trying to look for some excuses, some points to justify things. At least to justify even a little how long the war will go on, to somehow explain why this whole process is stalling. Soon we'll hear again from Putin's circle that the West deceived us, that we've been betrayed once more, that we've been let down, tricked, and so on, for the 1,555th time and so forth. Nothing new. They'll keep repeating the same old tune for a long time. The main thing here is that the war has become a tool for Putin and his closest circle to stay in power. They also make good money from it. And most importantly, it keeps them in power. And in fact, Putin has no other tool left except to keep the country in a state of war. This legally opens up a lot of things. It gives them free rein. This way they can collect money, pressure people, shut down anything they don't like, and so on and so forth. The war makes all of this possible. Without it, the regime simply can't hold on. War has already become the very purpose of existence for the Russian regime. And now it seriously clashes with society. The number of casualties, especially now, is hitting hard. Especially now, in recent days, with these Ukrainian strikes on the Leningrad region, they're getting closer to St. Petersburg, closer to Moscow. It feels like everything is drawing nearer. This also has a very serious depressive effect. But nevertheless, I repeat, Putin has no other option, no other path. He will cling to this war by any means possible. I think, unfortunately, they will be able to find resources, at least for the coming months.
Yaroslav, here's something else that's interesting. How do the oligarchs themselves, the ones Putin is asking for money, feel about this? I mean, how does Putin present it to them? The successes of this war of Russia against Ukraine, yes, in percentage terms, are less than 1%, those successes. Whether they will even finance all of this is also a question. Because, well, the sanctions due to the war primarily hit the oligarchs. After all, it's not just about certain things like oil or gas, but also about people, the very same oligarchs. What is the mood, in your opinion? I understand that this isn't exactly very open information, but if we analyze what we have now, the full picture.
Well, Deripaska is probably the most prominent representative of this oligarch class, who regularly voices some dissatisfaction with the war, wishing for it to be halted. But these are isolated cases. Everyone who didn't like it has basically left Russia. And now, the so-called oligarchs who remain are those who have the opportunity to try, the opportunity to receive their money, their profits, influence government decisions, get closer to power. But in many ways, they are making money off this war. Take Rothenberg, for example. He's not earning less, he's earning even more. I agree with you that the main problem for the oligarchs, even those who stayed close to Putin and are making money, is not that they're earning less. But the biggest, most important problem for them is really the Western sanctions, when their wives, mistresses, children, friends, and relatives can't, and so on, to be abroad, or even if someone is there, managed to get around, so to speak, the sanctions and didn't end up on the list of close associates. They themselves still can't go there, can't vacation there, and so on. This, of course, is a major discomfort for them. But the point is that Putin has seriously changed the balance of power over the past years, during these years of war, 4 years. That's all. Many disloyal people, many who had doubts, have simply left. This so-called mafia syndicate no longer looks like a syndicate. It is, in fact, already Putin's sole power. In 2022, there were still representatives of the bandits from the 1990s, the security services, Yeltsin's people, and so on. It was a kind of syndicate made up of different groups of influence, and Putin was balancing between them. If he was a dictator, it was for the Russians, but not for this group. Within that group of people, he was more or less an equal among equals in many ways. And he was forced on many issues, you could say, in his decisions. He was compelled. He had to balance things, somehow keep this rather motley crowd together. After 22, all of this basically no longer looks the same. There are no more people left there. Yeltsin's people are gone. A lot of businesses have left and so on. He single-handedly, in fact, controls everything. So to say that there are some oligarchs who might oppose Putin, you just need to look at their biographies like Sechin, Rothenberg, and others. These are all people who either in one way or another come from the security services and are friends of Putin, or at some point cooperated with him in some capacity and so on. That is, their entire careers, everything about them and all their influence, for most of them, is built on their connections to power, on their contacts with associates and so on, rather than being self-sufficient individuals. These aren't some Volvo businessmen who made their own money and now someone is just trying to take it away from them. No, often these people are simply fronts for Putin in many ways, through whom he made money and so on. You shouldn't have any illusions that in Russia there is some kind of a class of people with a lot of money who will suddenly, out of nowhere, speak out against the war. No, they have a lot of problems, a lot of discomfort, but they can't really do anything. Even now, there were still some lingering remnants of that significant influence, like that famous march we all remember so well, the one led by Prigozhin. That event was essentially a calculated attempt by certain internal Kremlin forces to somehow shift the delicate power balance. Their goal was to somehow influence Putin's decisions or perhaps even successfully overthrow him entirely. But that didn't happen. And after that, you can say that the circle has completely closed. So looking among the oligarchs for someone who could somehow influence stopping the war, well, I think that's an illusion. These are chameleon-like figures like Deripaska, earning money with one hand and telling stories with the other, probably trying to secure some benefits for themselves this way. Minimal preferences. Balancing but not crossing the red line either.
But in the current situation, wouldn't they at least want to try to save their money, their interests somehow? Not Putin nor the country as a whole. I think sooner or later this will ultimately cause things to unravel. The Kremlin regime. Well, in fact, let's see how events will unfold. Yaroslav, thank you so much for finding the time to join us live today. Yaroslav Makitra, head of political programs and the research company Sociopolis, was a guest on the live broadcast on the Freedom TV channel. Well,
So next, our colleagues will continue our broadcast. Andrei Sinitsyn, that's all from me for today. But I'll see you again at 12. As usual, there will be a fresh edition of the most relevant and most importantly, verified news from official sources. We will also talk about the situation at the front. We will discuss how the European Union insists that all the weapons purchased from the United States of America should be handed over to Ukraine. And of course, we will talk about how Trump's team is counting on progress in negotiations with Iran.
This and more will be discussed.
Stay tuned at noon.
stay with Freedom TV channel.